Hello everyone and welcome to the CSH seminar. Today we welcome Dr. Vidya Subramanian for the seminar presentation and Dr. Gayatri Nair as a discussant. Dr. Vidya Subramanian is an associate professor at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy since 2021. She is a sociologist studying how enterprise cultures shape the governance of public education. Her current research follows consultants and think tanks as they advocate for technology-based and data-driven interventions to reform education. Her areas of expertise include, amongst other things, technical education, gender and entrepreneurship, education policy, data, and governance. Her recent research examines young elite professionals' trajectories as they shift from conventional pathways into the development sector. Dr. Subramanian received a PhD and MPhil from the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, during which she also was a doctoral fellow at the Transnational Research Group of the Max Weber Foundation German Humanities Institutes abroad. Prior to joining Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, she has taught as well at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and has also been a consultant to the Tata Trust. Dr. Subramanian also holds an MA in Development Studies from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Her presentation today will be entitled Channeling Compassion Towards Change, Elite Volunteerism, Corporate Philanthropy, and Education Reform in Urban India. We are happy to welcome as a discussant Dr. Gayatri Nair, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of Social Sciences and Humanities, Indraprastha Institute of Information Technology, Delhi. Dr. Nair's research interests lie in urban informal labor, emphasizing the question of caste, gender, and technology. Focusing on political economy, her work interrogates the role of caste and gender in shaping traditional, so to say, livelihoods and new forms of work, specifically platform-based gig work, detailing how workers organize. Dr. Nair's work appeared in journals such as Contemporary South Asia, Journal of South Asian Development, and the Sociological Bulletin, and has recently published a book entitled Set Adrift, Capitalist Transformations and Community Politics Along Mumbai's Shore, published at Oxford University Press in 2021. Dr. Subramanian, the floor is now yours to present.
And thank you to CSH for organizing this. I'm Dr. Vidya Subramanian, and what I'm speaking of today largely draws on my PhD work. My PhD work was slightly different. It was focusing on interventions in public education, focusing on public-private partnerships, and specifically this organization that some of you may be familiar with called the Teach for India organization. So my focus there during my PhD was more to look at how, say, government and private actors engage with each other, and how does, say, policy change as a consequence of that. How does, say, school public systems respond to private interventions? How do private interventions look at public school systems? My PhD work sort of began with that. And what I'm taking towards now with my work is to look at the intervention itself in a much more larger perspective. So my presentation today focuses on the organization and the individuals within the organization, which is the Teach for India program, and to see how do these actors understand public education, and where are they taking their ideas from, and how do these discourses of, say, entrepreneurship, enterprise, performance, how do they sort of scale up into the policy system? How do we see these actors speaking about policy in certain ways? Where are they working in certain capacities, and how do these interventions sort of leave their mark scaling up in some ways? Uh, I begin with sort of just giving you a brief perspective on the Teach for India program itself. The Teach for India program today operates, at least when I did my PhD in 2014 to 2016, it was operating across 7 metro cities in India. Today, it works across 8. So there's Delhi, Bombay, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Madras or Chennai. There's Ahmedabad, Pune, and Calcutta. I'm just mentioning the names top of my head. I don't know if I've missed any. but largely the metro cities, which in itself is very telling if one really looks at the urban demography of the intervention and where it seeks to intervene in what kinds of public school systems. The idea of the intervention itself, how I studied it initially, was to look at methods around social network analysis, that is to see this intervention across a range of other organizations that connect to it, where the discourses flow, and also to do a sort of deep ethnography of the organization itself in particular school sites to see how practices change within that system. And I'd also looked at, of course, apart from interviews and observations, I'd used what was the Right to Information Act quite extensively at that point in time to unpack what the MOU or the Memorandum of Understanding is between private and public actors with the Teach for India organization. Now, when we look at this panel over here, I think all of us at some level have seen representations of this kind of optimistic attitude, not just amongst these young urban professionals who are in the TFI organization, but this kind of enthusiastic attitude seeps into multiple sectors. It isn't just education. It also in many ways is very telling about the youth and its entire sort of perspective towards change. The Teach for India program operates as a 2-year fellowship. And before I forget, the Teach for India program is an offshoot of the Teach for America program. This is an offshoot of the Teach for America model that operates across a number of countries across the world. And the way in which the Teach for India program operates in every country in many ways sort of adheres to or transmutes itself to that particular system. So here the Teach for India organization operates slightly differently from the Teach for America model, where there is at least some sort of engagement with the education space, whereas here they operate very separately from the accredited teacher qualification education space. They also have that leeway in many ways to operate in the nature of how, say, NGOs operate within the public school system. And it's also particularly very specific because these individuals, unlike regular school teachers, do not see teaching as their ultimate profession. That isn't their end goal at all. So when you ask them what their work is, they say that they are leaders in the system. They're not teachers in the system. So they do not associate themselves as teachers, even though a lot of their work engages with teaching and the teaching profession in the public school system. So the fellows are largely early career, largely, I'm saying from my sample, IT management professionals, many from engineering backgrounds, some who have done their BBA, MBAs, a lot of them, or at least some of them, who are early career corporate professionals who have a combination of, say, eco and MBA backgrounds, who worked for a while in the corporate sector and are looking to leave the hectic corporate sector and make a move into the development or the government sector. And this is particularly a great moment for many of them to make that transition as well, because the private sector has grown considerably in some ways in operating within, say, realms of CSR, philanthropy, and the social sector. So there seems to allow for mobility from conventional routes to these routes that were earlier seen as something that was the space of NGOs of a very different nature. They were NGOs perhaps I mean, just sort of generally speaking, NGOs that worked on, say, democratic rights forums, NGOs that, I'm not saying that do not still continue working in those spaces, but the nature with which NGOs looked at their work with, say, civil society actors was considerably different from these new age corporate NGOs, just for a certain categorization of where these organizations would fall. We see also in many ways an emphasis on leadership, management, entrepreneurship. These are the discourses with which they look at education as well. So a fellow would join or work as a for 2 years in a public school, largely here clearly a municipal corporation school, or a slightly higher, say, 6th or 7th grade in Delhi, a school that's run by the Delhi government. And they would work there for 2 years. And after that, they would transition to another role in the non-profit sector. So the experience that they gain within the education or the public school system is geared towards both understanding what the education space is, but using that knowledge and practice to be able to work in the non-profit sector, maybe consult with the government, but it isn't in any ways to work within the system for a longer period of time, but in a way outside the system, managing the system in certain terms. Now, these are just some of the donors of Teach for India. You, this is from the 2023 website. You can see a range of donors over here. How the organization has grown. It started in 2009 and up to the present, that is up to 2023. And if you see, the emphasis here is on the so much of the alumni and the children that they have reached. Not so much on their work within the classroom, but the impact outside the classroom. This is again just a sort of broad overview taking from my network analysis to see the kinds of organizations that Teach for India fellows go to. Some of these organizations have also been started by earlier TFI alums. Now, what's interesting here is that the organization as such, if one were to look at the scale of the country and the diversity of public school systems, operates in a very small segment of urban public school systems. But what is very interesting is on the way in which they've been able to capture a certain larger attention of what is the kind of work they're doing through after completing the fellowship, through the alumni networks, and where they are going after the fellowship, not so much in the capacity of the grassroots schoolwork, but the kinds of organizations they ultimately end up in and the ways in which that policy cycle flows upwards, not really within the schools that they're working in. Now, what's interesting also is that why are these professionals also entering the school space? That became a very important sort of curiosity for me when I started my PhD, is that these are individuals with conventional secure jobs. Why the interest to work within a school system? Where is that interest coming from? What is the nature really of unpacking that interest or passion or the need for change that they so often keep talking about when you engage or speak with them or interview them? Throughout now parts of my presentation, I also bring out vignettes of my respondents to sort of situate who these respondents are, where they're coming from, and what is particularly telling about the moment of the growth of the intervention, the nature of the coming of certain groups of middle classes, and the nature really so much of urban governance shifting, neoliberalization, and the particular sort of coming of certain kinds of middle class civil society actors within the NGO space. So this is Dhara, and when I asked her why is it that she chose to enter the school system, she'd worked for 5 years in the corporate sector, and a lot of her answers came from both a sense of nostalgia of the way in which she had worked with young marginalized children, maybe in the capacity of when she was a college student, she helped out, say, sanitation workers children, teaching them. So it came from a sense of nostalgia of giving back in certain ways. But her present position as a TFI fellow, when I interviewed her, was about how much she could do to be able to change the system from within. And this was an opportunity through which she was operating in the system. Now, when we're looking at the coming of the Teach for India program, it happens particularly, say, in 2009. It's also quite paradoxical in many ways because 2009 is also the time in which we have the RTE or the right to education coming up. So it's a paradox because at one level, you have the state coming in to guarantee certain rights, but at the same level, there is an opening up of the private sector in being able to, say, contractualize roles. You have interventions coming in, and even prior to the RTE, the opening up or the relaxing of the private sector into government spaces was ongoing. So it isn't particular to the Teach for India program, but it sort of piggybacks on these kind of processes that were already in motion. What's interesting here also is to give a brief history of when the organization comes into picture, Teach for India. It was started by Shaheen Mistry, someone who worked extensively in low income private schools in Bombay. And these were schools that were started in a very informal way for slum children to teach them, say, English, literacy, numeracy in a very informal way. And slowly it sort of becomes a school that gets affiliated in some ways by the state government. She's able to raise funds. She starts an organization called Akanksha Foundation. And then later on, when Teach for America's founder, Wendy Kopp, is looking at growing the intervention in India, she turns to Shaheen Mistry and asks her in many ways to become the front runner for the intervention's growth in India. What's also interesting is that when Shaheen Mistry thinks about the design of the program, she collaborates with a number of corporate organizations or companies, like, say, the Piramal Foundation that had a fellowship running. She speaks with the Boston Consulting Group. And it was these organizations that help her tailor the fellowship program in a way that it attracts or will be attractive to India's youth. Because volunteering in a certain fashion is not something that youth take very easily to in the Indian context. Volunteering generally is also understood as something that you do without money or without being paid for. It's something that you are passionate about or you're doing out of whatever it is, but it's seen as a charity, not really so much that's organized or paid for. So the model, when it comes in the Indian context, builds this element of leadership. That is, what is it that one can gain through 2 years of doing this program, what your work will do for the school system, the kind of change you're going to be making into the school system. And it also comes with a stipend and other kind of benefits. Of course, it's not as much as, say, a corporate benefit, but it is reasonably okay. And that's something that's even quite similar to the Teach for America model. But like I stated, the NGO operates completely separately from any kind of qualified teacher education space in the Indian context. The other important thing to dwell about is when the intervention came to India, it's also a time in which the school is the role of the school or the position of the school is also changing or shifting. We no longer see the school as something where children you are taught certain subjects in a certain way. It's an environment that also builds learning in certain values that are beyond, say, the job market. But with a lot of private interventions, such as Teach for India, operating within the school system, it also means that the idea of education is for skilling and employment. And it builds upon this very specifically across the teaching of subjects like, say, English, math, science. And it also tests for these particular subjects. It teaches all the fellows also, when they enter the fellowship program, have to be individuals who have graduate degrees, are English speaking. It's very telling because within the space of the school system, where they operate in the English medium sections, it's not necessary really for them to know the regional language or engage in any capacity with, say, social sciences or any teaching of languages outside the scope of English and the teaching of other subjects in English as well. So when these fellows do come into the school system, what is it that they're looking at doing apart from, say, the noble intention of change? There is also a strong idea here really is to be able to understand an education or school system on their own terms. And for a lot of them who are coming from, say, engineering or management backgrounds, it's also about what is it of the education system that they see that they can change. Because for these individuals from elite privileged backgrounds, education is the leveler that can make the change. It's a very liberal sort of meritocratic idea of education that they cater to. And for them, it isn't that the public sector needs to go away or the private will do its job better, but that the existence of the private makes the public more competitive, and the private values can actually make the public internally better. Something that's coming from the new public management approach, that it needs to imbibe from private actors to work more efficiently from inside. And it is these values really that they also in many ways advocate in the ways in which even how policies need to be designed. And that's something that I'll come to, because when they see teaching learning, they aren't really concentrating so much on the processes but the outcomes. What is the end goal that one needs to do? So a lot of the fellows who are operating or working in the school system also see the school system as a site to be able to try out new things. I'm here drawing from the work of Lily Irani when she speaks about, say, entrepreneurial citizenship. We see a number of elite professionals post the 1990s. What is often discussed is consumer citizenship, which is quite well known through the work of Riti Lukos, that we see the coming of the 1990s, neoliberalization, the emergence of a middle class, the boom of the IT sector, the coming of a certain privileged middle class working in the private sector, changes in consumption practices. So what Lily Irani does is that she builds on that work to say that it isn't just something that showcases a shift from, say, Nehruvian aesthetic and austerity to a certain new liberalized sort of consumption, but also that these individuals see themselves as a new heralder of India's progress, where the state is seen as a corrupt or inefficient, and how the private is the new efficient partner that needs to actually come in to have a say in how things need to change. And one of the big things that their focus is on how technology can change education as well. And here we see a number of the fellows when they are working in the space of the school system is how do we design certain products in ways in which that can also be working. Say you get a startup, you get venture capital, is something that my knowledge can be used in that space, wherein other non-profits can come in. So you see a certain chain or circuits of expertise also moving in that direction. So we, of course, at one level, we see these professionals coming in to talk about a certain change in the management practices of education, but it also has a certain clear idea of how, say, even technology can make education more efficient. What's interesting here really is the removal of the teacher in the classroom. You don't want the teacher as someone who will be the a more discerning element of teaching learning in the classroom, but someone who can just be given scripts of teaching learning to, and who will just communicate it like a content delivery person. That's a model with which they look at teachers, and technology is someone as assisting the teacher in being able to perhaps do this role better. Of course, when I've spoken about youth and elite youth as the primary sort of individuals in my discussion here, it's also about how they see the changing of the larger youth-based demographic dividend. These are elite youth actors talking about a large mass youth, and for them, they believe that you need to be able to give youth the opportunities to be entrepreneurial, and you need to not give them really if give them the knowledge or the practices in some ways, but it's something to ignite their own entrepreneurialism that can go ahead. So within the school system, it's being able to create a meritocratic order, being able to teach students, being able to sift out students who are good or better. But in many ways, it's not really seeing these students within the complexity of the social backgrounds in a very marginalized school system, but that at the end of the day there will be individuals who will perform well, who will do well, and it's them that need to go ahead and become leaders in the system. So for example, a lot of these fellows, one of the positives that's often seen about the fellows is that they do a lot of outreach in the communities where these schools are. What they do is they speak about, say, issues of, say, gender or domestic violence. They speak about it in the classrooms. Many of these students are also coming from marginalized violent homes, and it's expected that the student then becomes a micro leader in the community to spread the word ahead. So the student in some ways then becomes an extension to be able to spread certain values into the community. So you're not really looking at the system over here, but more in terms of how, say, individuals can make a change. There's a complete sort of reversal here, even in the terms of how, say, one looks at policy within, say, structures of delivery or structures with work. here the idea is that the system is not going to really change so much, but what we can do in our individual capacities is to be able to facilitate change. Now, what happens to these individuals once they complete the fellowship or the program is that they move on to, of course, most of them do not continue to work in the school. That's a given because they don't have the qualifications to work in the school, and none of them are really looking at working in the school long term. Very few individuals who remain passionate about teaching move into private schools to work there where the qualifications may be slightly different, but none of them are looking to work long term in the government schooling system. So what the idea really here is that they gravitate towards other non-profits that are working in close capacity with the government, and there a lot of these programs are able to have a sharing of their best practices, a sharing of their learning, where then you also see the government also implementing certain schemes and programs that might draw on these discourses. So one of the things is, I haven't really checked this for a year or two now, but there was something called the Change Makers Fellowship that was launched by the Delhi government. Its model in many ways was very similar to the Teach for India program, where you could allow a lateral entry. When I say lateral entry, you needed to be, say, a professional, there were certain qualifications, but you need not have to have been or worked in the government to enter the space and as a fellow work in any capacity in the Delhi administration for 2 years to understand the system and to propose, say, solutions or change. So it's an entry midway without really being a part of the system. A lot of the work that these fellows do is in the capacity of advocacy, consulting, assisting. So in that way, you also see them working in certain ways with the government. This is where I speak about the idea that for them, the school is too little a space to make an impact in. It's not enough to just say reach out to say 50 students, but whatever innovation they make must be able to reach more than that classroom. It needs to be something that has to go into a policy to impact as many classrooms as possible. It's a practice that needs to be replicated across a certain ecosystem. So in that way, they see an impact going across. And there's a certain very key idea that it is only in quantity that there is impact. I'll sort of end my discussion here in terms of what does it mean for the design of the policy itself when we're talking about these kind of interventions. The term that's often referred to, I think many of us would have heard about the term best practices. I think even in social science research today, grant making is in many ways emphasizes the idea that what best practices will you be bringing out from your research. And a lot of the best practices here, if one were to look at the nature of or unpacking best practices in the context of this intervention, is that the best practice is output oriented. You don't look at inputs. You don't look at the nature of the ecosystem. You don't look at the condition of the school. At the end of the day, it's intent and output. It's that what is measured. And it is that what then feeds into the policy to say that we will give, in many ways, the nature or design of outputs over inputs. So if when the scale itself moves that way, then you are not really considering so much the diversity of the system, but the end goal of what it is, of are you able to get these many children to read or write. I do not want to know, say that you don't have enough teachers in the school or this doesn't work or that doesn't work, but you need to be able to do that. And the modeling over here also often at times for the public school teacher is that the Teach for India fellow is able to do it. So why aren't you able to do it, having been in the system for so long? So it's even creating a certain parallel competition in some ways when the practice itself is inbuilt as to what is the best or ideal practice. So you see these shaping also ideas of data and governance, how say data is collected, how then does it then make a shift in how say the government will respond to a certain idea in education. A lot of that shifting towards say competitive ways of looking at outputs in education is intensified today. It is not to say that it hasn't existed, but the nature and the discourse has become more datafied. It has become more narrow in ways in being able to account for education, so much so that any other kind of spaces of teaching learning which cannot be measured, which are intangible, and so much of teaching learning often can be intangible, is not seen as valuable within this new sort of space and system. Uh, so that's about it, and I'll end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for this very rich presentation. I'll immediately give the floor to Dr. Gayatri Nair for her discussion.
Vidya, for that very insightful discussion. There are a lot of things I think that speak to both the current moment, but a lot in what you've sort of unpacked here also indicate certain kind of patterns from previous development discourses, practices that have really come out. One of the things that sort of jumped out at me was how similar this was to this entire 70s discourse around informal economies and untapped potential in these sources that could actually be pulled out. But what we're really seeing here is this transformation into and a scaling up really of how this enterprising self or enterprise as opportunity really manifests in various sort of aspects. So I think there are two important things happening here. One is a lot more of our recent discussion around, I think, scholars studying enterprise cultures has really been on the discourse around enterprise really and how it's sort of manifested. I think, in our entire conversations around Atmanirbhar Bharat and all of that brings that, quite front and center. But I think what has been mapped out slowly over a period of time is also to try and think about how it emerges in different kinds of practices. And I think particularly when you're looking at education, this is something that jumps out very starkly as to how do you put something like the enterprising self or enterprise as opportunity into practice, right? And the ways in which it invokes on certain older ideas of who can be the volunteer and who is the ideal volunteer here. As someone who studies questions of labor and work, this is always of interest because you can see how volunteerism itself gets articulated in very different ways by the state, right? So you have over here your classification of elite volunteers, right? A professionalization of volunteerism that has to be undertaken for, what the Teach for India fellows. And at the same time, you have, for instance, the approach of the state to other kinds of volunteers like, Asha and Anganwadi workers, right? Who in their professional capacity are also not quite professional enough, not worker enough, right? So very contrasting ideas about, who is the ideal volunteer when you have to think about an individual as the agent of action. Really, that sort of comes forward. I know you haven't invoked the other ideas of volunteerism, but I think it's tremendously important to think about a reinvocation of this elite volunteer again as it happens now. And also, I think to think about then in within the classroom itself, right? How do we again set up this notion of the enterprising culture into practice? So I think while it's you've done a great job of detailing for us how the Teach for India volunteer becomes this agent of enterprise and development and scaling up of action and efficiency, etc. There's also now this mode where it is being invoked into pedagogical practices itself, so that you have entrepreneurial sort of models or modules being introduced. I think the Delhi state government has already done this for school children. There's a skills and entrepreneurship university, with multiple campuses around Delhi that are being set up. So the ways in which they're also like thinking of bringing in a new kind of enterprising self, not merely the agent who would carry out this action in the classroom, but how do you really shape this new subject, amongst students themselves, right? And therefore telling us something about the nature of the enterprising self also. I think that it's not quite so stable and it's not quite so emergent even as we had sort of imagined. So when you read Guptu's work, for instance, it seems as though the enterprising self is here, the enterprising culture is already evident for us. But I think what your work really brings out is how this has to be very carefully and meticulously like put into practice. And it may or may not sort of ultimately create those models of the enterprising self. I was interested particularly in two, and I'll pose them as questions, and we can sort of open them up. I'm sure others will have queries as well. One is to think about the long-term sort of impact of this that you are tracing out. So starting from Teach for India, if I'm not mistaken, now there are multiple, and I think you trace them through that network analysis as well, multiple kinds of agencies and NGOs that are now involved in the educational sector. And what I was curious about is that if this role of the teacher is now being sort of reimagined, so we're looking at the one hand, as you're pointing out, as volunteerism being professionalized. Are we seeing a simultaneous deprofessionalization of teaching? I think you were indicating that, with this notion of the teacher as a content communicator primarily. Is it a form of de-skilling really at work that we see with teaching itself, right? And in that case, then what do we imagine as the skills now for a teacher, right? Who is ideal in the classroom at this point of time? Is it someone who's only going to be there for short periods of time, like these volunteers? Do we imagine any kind of long-term training, and what kind of skills would go into the making of that person? So that was one. And the other was particularly in the context of, today, a contemporary moment where civil society and, spaces are being sort of, censored, restricted, where certain kinds of NGOs remain sort of operable and most do not. What is particularly within the education space, right? What is the kind of room we can imagine for civil society actors to come in, for organizations to come in? Does it have to follow this kind of model of outcome based deliverables that are tied to questions of necessarily of efficiency and then tied into larger questions of development? So we have a very neat model of how we imagine development also. Or in the sort of older imagining of this, when we think about development as having multiple actors at play, social movements even within the space of education, really, how would we see the room for these actors to now operate? And I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nair, for these very important remarks and for these questions. Dr. Subramanian, I think it's right to just give you at least 5 minutes to try to answer all of that, and then we'll basically open the floor.
So I think I didn't touch up, enough on the discourse of how, say, volunteerism historically is operated in the Indian context. Volunteerism, at least from my reading, has in many ways been quite an elite endeavor. It's largely coming from a space of charity. So if you look at, say, Carrie Watt's work in the 19th and 20th century, you see that there is a certain class of people involved with, say, nation building. And even I'm not able to get her surname, Aditi work on looking at, say, upper middle class women and their work with regard to, say, charitable endeavors. So there is a certain eliteness to the discourse of volunteerism or giving back and helping those who are perhaps not from your same social status. So there is definitely a certain element attached to elitism, attached to the discourse of volunteerism. But the way in which, say, volunteerism has shifted or changed, say, from the 20th or the 21st century, is that at least with, say, organizations like, say, Teach for India or even prior, there's a certain credentializing of the work that you're doing. So you can use your volunteering experience as a very valuable credential as well, to say that you've volunteered, you're public minded, you're X, Y, and Z. So there's a certain shift also in volunteerism, not just as something that you're doing on the side when you wish to, when you want to, but it's also becoming highly organized in the way in which it operates. The notion of the ideal volunteer is, of course, over here in the Teach for India fellow, is someone who is giving of their time, of being there, of putting in the 2 years of that effort. What's also interesting is if you contrast this volunteer with the public school teacher itself, who's operating in the same school system. Now, a lot of privileges go into making the space of the volunteer sacrosanct and privileged. Now, the volunteer here is only focused on the teaching of English, maths, and science for their respective classroom. They don't have to do any number of the work that a public school teacher does apart from teaching, which means, say, census work, any kind of government work, survey work. Attendance also is not taken by the Teach for India fellow. It's largely done by the government school teacher in the English medium classroom. Midday meal handling, all the important administrative work, which is a very important part of the public school teacher's work, is done by the public school teacher. So her work actually increases in some ways with the Teach for India fellow being there. At least administratively, it does increase. In fact, it's quite interesting the contractualization of the teaching in the school system, because when I was doing the field work, often at times school teachers spoke to their principal saying that we need another teacher recruited into the school. We are not able to manage the work amongst us. So the principal says, you know what, the government said they'll give us 2 more TFI volunteers. I think that would like sort of help. So even the idea of, say, school teacher and the volunteer in the school is also eating up in many ways the work of the teacher. Like, you want a regular teacher, it isn't just about the teaching work, but the unending admin work also that needs to be shared. But the TFI volunteer coming in is not really going to help so much with the actual other work that the public school teacher does. And when we're talking about, say, entrepreneurship, now this is it's a discourse that has seeped everywhere. What do you mean by entrepreneurial? What is the practice of entrepreneurial? A lot of the early sociological work on entrepreneurialism or enterprise cultures, it takes it as a given that the 1990s is the time in which, like, magically everyone became entrepreneurial. But it isn't really sort of unpacking what do you mean by the entrepreneurial spirit or entrepreneurship. What are the different sort of nuanced classed backgrounds to who becomes an entrepreneur. What kind of work does an entrepreneur do? Who gets access to capital to be able to start something and become entrepreneurial? The kind of shift in, say, school curriculum over here, you have a number of competitions with business ideas. It's also very telling because the school itself or the curriculum itself is designed in a way to be able to say that it's important that children know how to start a business. They know how to engage in these contexts. So it isn't to say that any kind of business learning is bad learning, but when that becomes a dominant focus of education itself, it's very telling that everything else that you cannot translate into an economic angle, whether it's your credential, whether it's your education, whether it's your employment, is not really very valuable. So it's really very telling of that it's something that can be economized in some way, your learning. The coming of the skills and entrepreneurship university again is very telling about the ways in which, say, education has shifted in the 2000s itself, the policy shift itself, to say that it's very important to be able to look at economy demographic dividend through skills, to be able to see jobs and skilling. It's another thing that I mean, we have all seen the reports on, the poor quality of jobs and high underemployment, and the fact that youth is not really getting the kind of jobs that they want in the present situation, despite the demographic dividend advantage. In terms of the long-term impact, I think even the TFI and even now, there is definitely a deprofessionalizing of teaching happening. And I think this is impacting in the scale of the teachers, the public school teacher the most, especially those. I mean, deprofessionalizing early childhood care, if one were to think, doesn't even fall within the ambit of the RTE. It's hoped that it will come through, and that's the most deprofessionalized. It's also overrun by the private sector. I mean, the young children who are the most vulnerable, they have absolutely no clear sort of structure over there to be able to teach there. So even the ambit of the right RT at least comes from 6 onwards. It's hoping that will come with early childhood care, but that's not really happened as yet. So even when one is talking about deprofessionalizing, it runs deep from the young age itself. For young care itself, it's running deep. And deprofessionalizing has been in process with contractualizing from the 70s itself. It's not new, but it's a hyper model right now. And what's interesting in the Delhi context is with the Aam Aadmi Party, at least at that point in time when it was rising and it came into power, the entire focus was on public education and public health. And there was an entire focus that teachers are going to get their due finally. We are going to be able to make teachers permanent, give them autonomy, give them agency. But if you see the way in which the policy is played out, it's not really so much so. It is a lot of smoke and mirrors. You're not really seeing teachers get the kind of autonomy that the government claims to be giving them. So there is a high sort of deprofessionalizing happening also internally within the scope of the classroom of what, say, the teachers can or cannot do, and this has been ongoing for quite some time. uh, with regard to civil society institutions, I think the nature of funding itself has become very output driven. So a lot of the NGOs in the education space itself have shifted their ways in being able to get the kind of funding for the kind of work that they're doing. So here what's interesting is that if one were to look at, say, Aradhana Sharma's work on the Mahila Samakya program, what is the interesting thing that she says is that, see, education for empowerment. This program was for, say, adult women from marginalized sections. The nature of education was uh, not of the type in which, you go to school and learn, but a very different kind of pedagogy, and being able to teach them based on their lived situation. Khabar Lahariya, the newspaper, a lot of these Dalit women were part of it, are part of it. So what's interesting is what Aradhana Sharma says is that it was a government NGO that took this scheme ahead. But what's interesting is that it also started speaking the language of the NGO in certain ways to cater to the government. So they did their work, but they also were able to cater their language for certain requirements, to be able to say that, okay, we have to quantify empowerment, then we'll make these indicators as well. But what's now, see, any kind of creative or curricularly creative work in education often happens very limitedly, because the bulk of the ways in which funding has to be asked for is on the nominal terms of, how many like outcomes are there. Any of the big organizations funding, whether it's Bill and Melinda, Omidyar, any of them, they're very, very clear in terms of the outcomes that they want with education. So there's actually a clear shift even in the nature of the civil society organizations in education for how they are seeking educate, how they're seeking funding, terms with which they're seeking funding. Older NGOs that operated in a much more empowerment perspective of education, not just as something, creating jobs, but something to do with empowerment. That discourse has shifted very differently for the organization. There are also very few, but bulk of them have now shifted really in terms of being able to capitalize on funding for outcomes. And it's also very safe in many ways, because when you say how many people can read and write is safer than saying how many students can think. It is actually much more safer to say that they can read and write, but if you say think, that's a much more difficult thing. So there is definitely a shift to that space.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. Thank you, Dr. Nair, for being here today. Enjoyed really this session. Just wanted to announce for everyone the next CSH seminar will be the 13th of May, Monday as usual, with Odilori, the director, presenting what does my IHN tag actually mean, the relationship between academic titles and job positions. Quite a good continuum with what we talked about today. Thank you again for to everyone for your listening. See you.